you described your dad in the book as a walking powder keg of repressed grief, and I was, I was just wondering what you kind of meant by that, and what did you see when you saw repressed grief? How was it manifesting in him?
Anger and substance abuse. I mean, I talk about my own how much I was drinking by the time I became a father. And I mean, when I say substance abuse, it sounds ridiculously anachronistic. All we're talking about is someone around in the 1970s who finished work and went down the pub, had 3 pints, came home a bit pissed and in a bad mood and feeling a bit impatient with having a young family, and punished his boys physically when they stepped out of line. None of this was remotely unusual. And it's very odd to use these sort of jargony words, but he caused a lot of pain, and we were all really frightened of it. And that's not ideal. And part of the grief was to do with mum and dad lost their first child. Now that, as a father of two, is almost unimaginably hard. My oldest brother Martin died of meningitis when he was 6, and I was born 10 months later. So I've always felt that I was lucky and particularly wanted, and I think that's partly why I was so close to mum. But again, dad, just won't have had the resources to discuss that with anybody. I don't even know if they, it was completely beyond me whether they even talked to each other much about it. But to have something so horrifying happen, but not be equipped to talk about it or to process it. I mean, that generation, mum and dad's generation, boomers, basically, they are all the sons and daughters of soldiers, if you think about it. They're brought up by people who necessarily had to, just get on with it. And they didn't get support when they came home. So, you get this sort of ongoing generational thing where we just can't talk about this stuff, and I just believe that it's the magic bullet that talking, even though it doesn't feel it's particularly helping in the long run, even in the medium term, it really does help a lot.
And as you say, you had this sort of very close relationship with your mum, which makes it all the more, painful. It's always incredibly painful, but and she used to read you stories, and you had this very kind of close bond, and that was obviously a huge influence on you. Do you think? How do you think kind of do you think that relationship sort of formed you in some way? That closeness with your mum. And did you have a sort of uncomfortable? You said in the book you had a slightly uncomfortable relationship with being a mummy's boy.
Yeah, again, there's no female equivalent, is there? There's mummy's girl. That's fine, isn't it? But somehow there's a rite of passage that I resisted, where you're supposed to start despising your mother. You're supposed to start kind of patronizing her, dismissing her. You notice that she's a woman. And so, I can't be bothered. I'm not spending time with my mum. What? And I sort of didn't do that. I was sort of happy. I really liked her company, and I didn't want to be a pain in the arse to her. As a teenage boy, I was perfectly happy hanging out with my mum, and it's not like anybody. I don't think anybody particularly called me a mummy's boy, but I was slightly ashamed of that friendship, because it wasn't really what I was supposed to do. Now, I know there are lots of boys who are close to their mums, but I'm not saying I'm unique in any way, but I think it's really weird that I was kind of made to be embarrassed by it. She was the sort of she was the indispensable parent, really. She was the kind of solid thing in the middle of everything else shifting. So that's why losing her was such a big deal. But then life goes on, and so you learn to adapt. But yeah, that was partly why it was hard. It was also hard, the timing, you know, it could have been worse. I think losing a parent when you're 8 must be worse than when you're 17, but or something like that. But it felt like we had just started to have a sort of grown-up relationship, and we just started to have conversations. So that's why, you know, it felt particularly cruel for her to sort of disappear at that point.